Now we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of what Indians are all about.
I still say we Indian people are believers in the truth. This is the way of life that was given to your people. You're born an Indian, you're going to die an Indian. Indianness is a good life. You're facing an Indian this afternoon.
Good Saturday afternoon out there, everyone. Welcome to Native News Today. I'm your host, Jason Salzman, here in the Muskogee Media Studios. And let's get started right off the bat this week with some big news nationally. Of course, the government shutdown lasting for 3 days, sort of postponed really till February the 8th. And with that, a lot of that ties in with Muskogee Creek Nation. So I was granted an exclusive interview at the beginning of this week with Principal Chief James Floyd as he talked about government shutdown and what it means for MCN. What are the preparations being made in the event of where we may see this again, or what we have done, such as meetings you've had with your cabinet or people or lobbyists, our lobbyists in Washington, any of that you can share with us about the shutdown?
Well, first, let me go back to May, because that's when hearings were held on the 2018 budget. And so I testified in front of the House Interior Appropriations Subcommittee, and there's several things I asked at that time. One was that they follow regular order, which means they have hearings both in the House and the Senate side, and that we have a budget, because for the past 3 years we've operated on continuing resolutions. And so I explained to them some of the problems with operating on continuing resolutions. And so it's strange that we find ourselves now in January, and 4 months into the fiscal year, still operating on continuing resolutions. And this one today, if it's signed by the president, will be through February the 8th. And we'll be going through the motions of restarting on the federal side the processes they interrupted on Friday night at midnight, to be able to work with the nation. Now, as the nation, we are in pretty good shape, because we've fortunate that health and safety programs remain funded. So through the Indian Health Service, we were contacted and said that we have the authority to continue to operate, and as self-governance tribes, any revenues or any appropriations that we have, we can continue to spend. And so, it takes us a certain time into the future should this have been prolonged. We receive the same from the Department of Justice, so our Light Horse could continue to operate. And I think the Department of Indian Education, that they would continue to fund their educational requirements. So there are provisions for the essential services to continue. Fortunately, we provide a lot of essential services. And so for instance, the military, they will receive their pay through the end of January. Now, by going to 30 days, it'll be through the end of February. And that's important because we have citizens who are service members, and they rely upon both active duty pay and then benefits for service-connected disabilities. So it's good that we revisit the issue and can assure our citizens that with these interruptions, that we can continue to deliver those services that people need.
Now, when you say we can keep delivering those services, when there might be an instance where we do need to fill a gap where government is shut down, do you know where that funding source is from us? Is it gaming revenue? Is it permanent fund? Anything like that you could share? Do you know?
As a self-governance tribe, both with the Department of the Interior and HHS, we get kind of front-end funding under our self-governance compact agreements, and as much as the federal government can provide us under their authority, but we get to put that money in the bank and draw interest upon it until we use it. So, this being January, we haven't used all the money that they've given us so far, and so, it's times like we're in right now that's very important because we need to utilize those funds. Now there would come, should this be prolonged for some, extended length of time, then yes, we would have some problems. But I would say with a surety that 30 days or so, we're fine. And in this case, they were just 3 days out and came to an agreement. We'll see where this one goes. But I still go back to the fact that we really need appropriation bills, individual appropriation bills, because the risk of having the continuing resolutions are that, in this case, the federal government can only provide commitments to February 8th. And it's really hard, having worked for the federal government, to put short-term contracts in place. You spend more money than the value you get when you spread your commitment over a 12-month period of time. And so, I'm sure that this is messaged many ways by many people and in the different parties, but the net result to the operation of the government is that it gets interrupted or it gets shortened in some way that you can't take full use of the efficiency that you can get with a 12-month appropriation.
What potential do you see that could result in a possible shutdown? Let's just say it goes to 30 days, or where it would be an issue for us in seeing employees not being able to come to work.
Well, definitely we'll stay in communication with them should we see something that would even appear to have any indication that would extend over even a week or two, and prepare them. We would be just like the federal government. We do know that after the federal government reopens, then they generally repay the expense that you would have for the services that you provided during the shutdown, and we would expect the same. And so we would instruct our people who provide the essential services that those will continue, and then should it go for an extended period of time, which is very unlikely, but still is a possibility in the environment that we're in, then we have to pick and choose who can come to work and who couldn't. But fortunately, we didn't this time, and hopefully we won't in the future.
Chief, as you said, you've worked on both sides now, federal government, tribal government. What is something like this, a government shutdown, no matter how long it is, but what effect does it have on general operations between tribal and federal entities? A couple of examples I would say would be HUD with housing, IHS with health, transportation with the Department of Transportation, things like that. What kind of effect does it have on the general operations there?
Well, I think in general, you can't help but have some type of a slowdown, because whatever works in progress most likely halts during the shutdown of the government. And regardless if it's a day or 3 days like we've had here, then they have to go back in and restart. And so you lose the momentum that you've had. And so it may not have a profound effect upon us, but it prolongs some of the issues that we deal with. And this week, there's some issues that I had hoped to deal with the Bureau of Indian Affairs on. Got a call late Friday evening that told me that they most likely won't be able to meet with me this week, so that pushes things back at least a week. And so it's things like that policy decisions get pushed back. And so you can't help but have some negative effect regardless of the length of time that the government shut down.
Would you see some similarities, the effect that you talked about there with policy and communication, really, being able to get in the same room, as you said, affecting things like pending legislation, 47 Act, Murphy case, things like that? Do you see a trickle effect there as well? Well,
the Murphy Act that you mentioned is a good example, and it's one I was on the phone Friday trying to make sure with our lobbyist and with the Department of Interior, the acting assistant deputy secretary, on the phone with him to make sure that these things get prepared, as well as with the House staff on the 47 Act, so that it continues to move and gets scheduled for markup in February. That's our goal. And here it is, at the end of January, and we get an interruption. The staff gets exhausted because they're working till wee hours of the morning without pay themselves, and so it wears on them. And I just hope in all of this, interruption between the federal government and legislative branches that things like the 47 Act markup don't get lost. So we hope that it doesn't. I was assured Friday evening that things are still on track, and we'll follow up tomorrow on that.
We had talked with you just recently here about your excitement for the new year, specifically for things like the master plan, really
Yes.
focusing in on a master plan for the nation. You mentioned that a large part of that is us being aggressive in getting grants. Any effect you see with sort of the uncertainty in federal government with being able to get those grants that we need to do master planning?
I think what we will see in terms of grants that we would go apply for, that's in conjunction with the master plan, is that it would be later in the year when they award those, because their money's being parceled out to them in short increments. And so to be able to offer a grant program nationally that we'd be able to apply for, they have to have enough money and the authority to support the grants. So what we may expect in, let's say, March may come as late as August. And so it does have an effect. And that goes back to why when I spoke before the subcommittee, that we've got to have an appropriation bill. We need to follow the normal process and have hearings and hearing reports that we can use so that even administrative language surrounding the grant can be inserted and applied so that we don't have these delays in any operation, because there's significant items that we need to deal with.
From a tribal administration stance, is there any feeling one way or another on how this is being handled federally between congressional, even executive ends? What's going on? Because we can't get away from having an eye and really caring about how the federal government is operating with a lot of our programs. Any official administrative stance or one that you would like to provide with how you see this is played out? I mean, I know that government will be government, there will be disagreements, but how are you and other tribal leaders seeing how this is really played out?
Well, on Friday, I spoke to two of the other leaders of the 5 tribes, and we had conversations based on legislation, essentially. But I was like probably any other citizen of the nation Friday night, at 11 o'clock at night, watching TV to see what they're going to do. And the dynamics are, very diverse. As you noticed, on the floor of the Senate, there was 2 camps, essentially, trying to come to some type of negotiation at the final minutes of the evening, and they didn't. The vote wasn't the way they wanted it, so they left, and there was no talk on Saturday. There's a lot of dynamics at play, and I think, especially at this time, it's really difficult to understand who's really in the leadership position, whether it be in the House or Senate or the White House. That confusion ends up affecting the legislative processes to some degree. And fortunately, we have people who work with the staff members to make sure that regardless of what goes on that's visible to the public, behind the scenes, that hard work that needs to take place continues. And as we talked about earlier in this conversation, the markup scheduling, make sure that that's done so that when they come back tomorrow, as they had planned to look at the schedule of markups in the month of February, it proceeds the way that it should. And so we had everything lined up. We just hope that tomorrow it follows through the way that it should.
But before we get to February 8th, Chief, is there any plans that have been made or any instructions from you to get some people together in a room about this, whether it be a cabinet meeting to look at it again or an executive level meeting, anything like that, as far as planning and just getting it on the radar of some of the department heads?
Mm-hmm. Well, we did speak briefly about this today in the cabinet meeting. We want to make sure that they all were aware of the status. I'll be speaking with the Speaker of the National Council here this afternoon, and he and I will also be discussing some of the things that could be potential impacts should another continuing resolution fail to pass. We'll work to be prepared along those lines. And I'm thankful that cabinet members have the awareness that they have already kind of preemptively taken the actions they need to assure that things continue and we serve our citizens. So it was that's why we had a brief conversation. They had already planned and made provisions for continuing services. We just want to assure the citizens that today, as we're going through this experience of the continuing resolutions and the interruption of the government, that our citizens feel that we're looking out for them and we're preparing so that there's no break in service to them. And fortunately, hopefully they didn't see any of that over the weekend or today, and we hope that they don't experience anything like that in the future.
All right, our next feature is with a gentleman that is in the final stages of getting an application granted for an Oklahoma City charter school just from an indigenous perspective, the Sovereignty Community School of Oklahoma City.
My name is Phil Gover. I am the director of the Sovereign Schools Project at TEDNA, the Tribal Education Department's National Assembly. I'm also the lead applicant for the Sovereign Community School, a proposed charter school in Oklahoma City. The ideas that sort of inform the mission for the school are really born out of a community conversation. So I work with an organization called the NACA Inspired Schools Network. That's a nonprofit school network based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. NACA is the Native American Community Academy. That's a charter school that was founded in 2006 to serve the Native community in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I first visited NACA in 2009 when I was working as an associate director of admissions at Dartmouth College, and I was looking for talented Native kids to bring to the middle of the woods in New Hampshire. When I first walked into NACA, I had never seen a school like that before. I'd never been in a school building where I could be comfortable, and I felt like at NACA I could be who I really am. When I first moved to Oklahoma City 3 years ago, I knew that there were only a handful of places in the country where you could realistically do what NACA did, right? Because you need a critical mass of families and kids with an indigenous identity to kind of pull off what they pulled off. So when I first moved to the city, I had this in the back of my mind, even though I wasn't working in this work 3 years ago when I moved here. The ideas really began to take shape probably about a year and a half ago when I first started working on sort of the creation of new charter schools for Native communities in Oklahoma. By no stretch of the imagination am I doing this by myself. And in fact, I greatly benefit from the folks who serve on my school design committee, who are all local, local parents and Native educators and community organizers, have been a tremendous help. I mean, absolutely critical to the work of pulling the school together, because NACA Inspired Schools Network whole ethos around school design is the notion that our communities know our communities know what we need, right? Our parents know what we need, and all you have to do to figure out what that is ask them. And we go and we ask parents and educators and people who care about Native communities, what do you see in this community that can be helped by education? What we found was, one, there's a sense among parents especially that our kids start to, I think the word that kept getting used was slip through the cracks in middle school, and that as they progress through their high school careers, more and more families are dropping out of the system. And that actually bears itself out in Oklahoma City Public Schools' own data. If you look at enrollment and retention for Native students, you look at where sixth graders start, you have some huge population of sixth graders. By the time you get to 12th graders, it's like half the kids are gone. Native students in Oklahoma City Public Schools have the lowest graduation rate of any demographic group in the entire system. So there's a huge need there, and parents are right. They sensed it. They can't cite OKCPS's graduation rates, but they had a sense that our kids are getting lost in this system, and that something needed to change. And so I think that's that idea is what propelled us forward to thinking about, well, how do you go beyond identifying your grades? How do you begin identifying your curriculum, your content, your school mission, the kinds of teachers you want to hire, what you're going to do in the classroom, what your calendar day looks like. We're in that kind of detail now, and once we get approved, we'll actually be going from like the theoretical, like, oh yeah, it's nice to like, right, like we have this proposal for like an Indigenous languages program. That's all it is right now. It's on paper, it's a proposal. We still have to do all of the work of designing and the content and the scope and sequence, and that stuff's going to happen over the next 18 months. So once we get approved, we will transition from the theoretical proposal to actual creating content and preparing to deliver it to kids in classrooms in 2019. Our challenge as a school and as a community is going to be to have a balance. And I think on one hand, you have this balance of like, we don't want to be too pan-Indian, right? Like we don't want to already reinforce notions that non-natives have about Indian people. Like, oh, all Indians are the same, or all Indians, live in teepees or whatever crap like that. Like we want to preserve, we want to create a sense of solidarity in our communities, but we also want to be able to celebrate like our individual cultural heritage and enrichment. Because one of the amazing things about Oklahoma, and this is a real distinction between the, say, like our work in Oklahoma versus the work that NISN already does in New Mexico. In New Mexico, you have the Pueblos, you have the 19 Pueblos, and you have the Navajo people and the Hopi people. And culturally, they all sort of fit into like a paradigm, right? They're not the same, but they're related to each other. In Oklahoma, that's not true at all, right? Like all of our people were removed here from places all over the country. And so we don't have like a shared cultural identity in a lot of ways, even though I think most people would assume we do because we're all Indians. And so we're gonna have to find a balance between creating that sense of solidarity of like, I am Indigenous and I'm proud of that, but I'm also proud of being Choctaw or Comanche or Pawnee or Creek or whatever my individual tribal identity is, and I'm going to leave this school more informed about where I come from and who my people are and where my family comes from than if I had just been in the regular traditional public school system or gone to a private school or stayed home school or something like that. As a public charter school, our school gets almost all of its funding from the state and federal government. So in Oklahoma, well, in most states too, but in Oklahoma, tribes have a really unique ability. Tribes in Oklahoma are the only tribes in the country that can directly authorize their own charter schools. Now, our school in Oklahoma City is not being authorized by a tribe, it's going to be authorized by the local public school district. But tribes in other communities could avail themselves of the option of authorizing a school directly and creating it from scratch. Now, what that means is once you create a charter school, the per pupil funding that funds all public education follows students, right? So in a district the size of Oklahoma City Public Schools, some 45,000 kids, right? Like the 150 kids that will move from, like, say, Oklahoma City Public Schools to our school in Oklahoma City is a negligible amount. It would be different in a smaller or more rural community, but you also wouldn't be taking 150 kids, right? Like 150 kids is like all the kids in a school, whereas maybe only half of those kids are tribal. And so the funding it's all publicly funded. If you look at the way the charter school funding works as like a pie, about 70% of the pie is state money. So money from the state of Oklahoma. It's our taxpayer dollars, my income tax dollars, all funding, your income tax dollars, all funding public schools in this state. And then 20% is federal money. Stuff like Title I, Title VI Indian education programs, Impact Aid, all of that stuff also flows to our school as a local education agency. And then the last 10% is for charter schools tends to be philanthropy. So we're gonna have to do some fundraising. We're gonna have to apply some money for private foundations and maybe even tribes and tribal education programs and things like that. For most public schools, like a traditional public school, that's bond dollars. That's charter schools don't have access to bond dollars in this state, so there's a funding gap. Charter schools are actually less funded than a traditional public school for that reason, and so we have to make up the gap with fundraising. In the case of like a tribal charter school, tribes can make up the gap pretty easily, especially because I think tribes have a capacity already, right? Like a tribe might not have to give money to their own school, But if you're letting a school use your building for almost no rent, that's as good as, I mean, you know how much my facility is going to cost me in Oklahoma City? It's going to cost me like $250,000, right? Like, if I didn't have to spend that money, you know how much more I could pay my teachers, or how much like a better of a transportation system I could provide for my kids. So it's all a balance. It's all, I mean, I think we're gonna get really good at in the next 4 or 5 years at figuring out the best way to allocate resources in a system, Oklahoma, that dramatically underfunds public education, but we can still make it work in this state, and I think tribes can make it work too. We submitted our application on October 20th. Under state law, the district has 90 days to reply to our application. We actually mutually agreed on an extension to February 12th, which is when the school board will take up our application and vote on it. In the meantime, so we did a presentation in front of the Oklahoma City Public Schools board on November 13th. We did an interview with a bunch of their staff members on November 29th. And then we've answered about 3 series of questionnaires, probably 40 or 50 different questions about our application on paper. We've done written replies to all of that, and we did that through December and into January. And now we sent our final submission, which was some budget stuff, last week. And now we just kind of out of our hands. We just kind of wait for the feedback from the district on our application, which I think we'll get next week. And that'll tip the hand a little bit as to what we can expect from the school board in terms of a vote. If the school board votes yes, then we negotiate a charter and we're good to go. Then now we got to go move from the theoretical to the actual, hire a school leader, do a whole bunch of crazy stuff. If the school board says no, then we have an automatic appeal, which we can take up to 30 days to avail ourselves of. So we can respond to the district's feedback and criticism of our application, resubmit a new application within 30 days, and then the district has 30 days after we submit to answer our appeal. If the district says no a second time, we can take that appeal to the State Board of Education, and they can consider our appeal. If the state board says yes, then we're chartered. And if they say no, then we're done. Then our application's done. Will look very similar to any academic program you might find at a rigorous public school anywhere else in the country, but our curriculum and our content is going to be told from the perspective of Indigenous people. And that's a radical way of thinking about the world. And ideally, what we create in our kids by the time they leave 12th grade is we've fostered in them, I think, an Indigenous consciousness that prepares them for bigger and better things. College, post-secondary, whatever it is, so that whatever their passion is, right? Like, hopefully they leave our school and they know how to contribute to our communities, to our nations. That's, if we are successful, that's what our kids will be doing.
All right, a lot to get to this week, so we're going to have to wrap it up quickly, but we want to thank you all for joining us. We hope you enjoyed our 2 features, and you can find them on our YouTube channel throughout the week. We'll see you guys next time. Have a great one. You've been watching Native News Today.